My parents slid a $3 scratch-off ticket across the Thanksgiving table toward me while handing my sister a $14,000 luxury Caribbean cruise package. They laughed and told me that losers have to rely on luck. They had absolutely no idea that cheap piece of paper was a jackpot winner for $130 million. When the truth finally came out, I woke up to 85 missed calls from the very people who tried to publicly humiliate me. My name is Maya. I am 31 years old. Before I tell you how I turned their ultimate insult into my perfect revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of a toxic family dinner. The dining room of my parents' sprawling Atlanta suburb home was suffocating. My mother Valerie tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver spoon, commanding the attention of everyone at the table. The smell of roasted turkey and collard greens filled the air, but my appetite was already entirely gone. Sitting across from me was my older sister Chloe, the undisputed golden child of the Washington family. Chloe graduated from Howard University with honors, and my parents never let anyone forget it. Next to her sat her husband, Chad. Chad was a white, condescending cryptocurrency bro who constantly felt the need to explain basic financial concepts to me as if I were a small child. Our father Marcus sat at the head of the table, beaming with pride as he looked at Chloe and Chad. It was a picture-perfect scene of upper-middle-class success, but the entire facade was built on a foundation of lies and blatant favoritism. I sat quietly at the opposite end of the table, nursing my glass of water, waiting for the inevitable moment when their attention would turn to me. It happened every single holiday. I was the designated scapegoat, the family failure who dared to pursue her own path instead of conforming to their rigid expectations. My mother cleared her throat and beamed at Chloe and Chad. She pulled a thick custom-embossed envelope from her designer blazer and handed it to them. She announced that to celebrate their anniversary and all the recent financial successes Chad achieved, she and my father were gifting them a 2-week all-expenses, paid luxury cruise through the Caribbean. The table erupted in applause. Chloe squealed and kissed Chad while my father proudly patted his son-in-law on the back, congratulating him on being such a fantastic provider. Then my mother turned her gaze to me. The warmth completely vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a flimsy, brightly colored piece of paper. She slid it across the long mahogany table. It stopped right next to my water glass. It was a $3 lottery scratch-off ticket. I stared at it, trying to process the sheer disrespect of the gesture. My mother smiled a tight, insincere smile. She said she figured since my little app design hobby was not paying the bills, I could use a little extra luck just to keep the lights on in my apartment. Before I could even process the insult, Chad leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. He gave me that familiar, patronizing smirk he always wore when he was about to talk down to me. He told me that my mother was absolutely right. He said that playing around with basic code and calling myself a tech founder was cute, but it would never build generational wealth. He loudly advised me to get a real job, maybe something in retail or administration, and leave the serious wealth building to the professionals. He actually had the nerve to say that as a black woman in the tech industry without a degree from a top-tier school, I was mathematically destined to fail. I looked at Chad and felt my blood boil. The sheer audacity of this man lecturing me about wealth was laughable. I looked him dead in the eye and calmly reminded him that my little app design hobby fully funded my life and paid my rent, while my parents had secretly remortgaged this very house to bail out his failing crypto startup last year. The entire table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Chloe turned pale, and my father slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the plates. He ordered me to respect my brother-in-law immediately. My mother stood up, pointing a trembling finger at me, demanding I leave her house for ruining their perfect Thanksgiving dinner with my lies. I did not shed a single tear. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I calmly stood up from my chair, picked up the $3 ticket, and told them to enjoy their dinner. I walked out the front door, leaving their toxic screaming match behind me. The crisp November air hit my face as I got into my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, letting the quiet wash over me. I reached into my center console, grabbed a quarter, and began scratching the silver coating off the ticket my mother had thrown at me like garbage. I scratched the first row, then the second. Number by number, the symbols matched. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, thinking the streetlights were playing tricks on my vision. But the numbers did not change. I did not win $20 for gas. I matched the Mega Millions jackpot. I was holding a piece of paper worth $130 million. This massive fortune was my ultimate weapon now. I smiled as I realized that I would use every single penny of it to completely destroy them once and forever. The morning sun caught the edge of my phone as it buzzed relentlessly against the cool marble of my kitchen island. It was vibrating so hard it was inching toward the edge, threatening to fall. I picked it up and stared at the glowing screen. 85 missed calls, 112 unread text messages. My heart gave a familiar, anxious flutter, a leftover physical response from decades of walking on eggshells around my family. But then the reality of my new bank account settled over me like a heavy protective armor. I tapped the voicemail icon and poured myself a cup of black coffee. I leaned against the counter and listened to the panic unfold in real time. The first message was from my father, left at exactly 6 in the morning. His voice carried that familiar sharp bark, the one he always used when I missed a Sunday dinner because I was working overtime to pay my own college tuition. Maya, pick up the phone right now. Your mother is sick with worry about you storming out on Thanksgiving. You need to come over here today and apologize to your sister and Chad. Furthermore, I told you I needed the garage cleared out this weekend so Chad can park his Porsche safely. Do not make me come down there and find you. I deleted the message without a single second thought and let the next one play. It was from my mother, left barely 2 hours later. The shift in her tone was so drastic it gave me genuine whiplash. The sharp, demanding matriarch from yesterday was completely gone, replaced by a sickly sweet Southern belle dripping with fake affection. Maya, baby, it is Mom. We are just so worried about you. You left so fast yesterday and you barely ate a thing. I just pulled your absolute favorite peach cobbler out of the oven. Why do not you come home, sweetie? We miss you so much. We can talk about everything. Just family. No fighting. I scoffed into my coffee mug. The third message was from Chloe. Her usual smug superiority was entirely absent, replaced by a frantic, breathless energy. Maya, you need to call me back immediately. Chad saw an article online about a local tech founder winning the Mega Millions through an LLC. Maya, tell me that is not you. Tell me you did not just win $130 million after Chad offered to buy you dinner last night. Maya, pick up the phone right now. This is not funny. Then came Chad. His voicemail was an absolute masterclass in manipulation. Maya, it is Chad. Listen, I know things got a little heated at dinner, but you know we all love you, right? Chloe is acting crazy, but I told her you would never hide something like this from us. If the article is true, I just want to say congratulations. As a professional wealth manager, I know exactly what kind of vultures are going to start circling you today. You are going to need someone you trust to handle this kind of massive capital. Call me back as soon as you get this. We need to lock down your portfolio before the taxes eat you alive. You need a man who understands the system, Maya. Do not do anything stupid. I took a slow sip of my coffee and let the total silence of my apartment wrap around me. They knew. The local business blog had published a tiny, vague blurb about a massive lottery payout claimed by a newly formed LLC registered to an Atlanta-based software developer. Chad, with his obsessive tracking of local financial news, had pieced it together. He remembered the $3 ticket my mother threw at me. He remembered my tech background. He did the simple math. For 31 years, my phone had never rang with this much urgency. When my car broke down on Interstate 25 years ago, my father told me to call a tow truck because he was busy watching a football game. When I spent a week in the hospital with severe pneumonia, my mother visited exactly once for 20 minutes before complaining about the parking fees and leaving. But now that I was worth more than their entire wealthy neighborhood combined, suddenly I was their top priority. Suddenly, my mother was baking my favorite dessert from scratch. I watched the text messages continue to roll in across my lock screen. They were bargaining, negotiating, and demanding my attention. My father sent a text saying he always knew my tech skills would pay off in the end. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically choke on it. I set my phone face down on the marble counter. I refused to let them dictate my morning. I was not the scapegoat daughter anymore. I was the sole architect of my own life. I walked over to my laptop and pulled up the legal documents for the blind trust I had established yesterday. The money was completely safe. The assets were securely hidden behind ironclad layers of corporate shielding that Chad could never penetrate, no matter how many fake luxury watches he wore to his failing office. I had spent the last 48 hours making absolutely sure that my wealth was untouchable. Let them call. Let them panic. They were currently drowning in the realization that the daughter they treated like absolute garbage was now holding all the cards. I moved toward the bathroom to start my morning shower, feeling a profound sense of peace. For the first time in my life, I held the ultimate power over my family dynamic. I did not have to answer to them. I did not have to shrink myself to make them feel big. That hard-won peace was violently interrupted by a sudden aggressive pounding. The doorbell buzzed loudly 3 times in rapid succession. The heavy knocking rattled the solid front door of my apartment. I froze in the hallway. The security gate downstairs required a registered key fob to enter, but Chloe had always possessed a way of manipulating her way past any building concierge. The pounding grew louder, more demanding, echoing through the quiet space. "Maya, we know you are in there, open the door." It was my father's voice booming through the thin walls of the hallway. I tightened the belt of my silk robe and walked slowly toward the front door. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I consciously forced my breathing to slow down. I stepped quietly up to the heavy wood and leaned in to look through the small glass peephole. My entire family was standing in the hallway outside my apartment. My father was raising his fist to hammer on the door again. My mother was holding a foil-covered baking dish tightly against her chest with a strained smile. Chloe was pacing nervously back and forth, while Chad stood slightly behind them, clutching a sleek leather briefcase tightly to his chest. They had come for their payout. I reached out and unlatched the heavy deadbolt, sliding it back with a sharp click. I pulled the door open and was instantly assaulted by the overwhelming smell of cinnamon and baked peaches. My mother stood on the welcome mat holding a large foil-covered glass dish. Her face was stretched into a massive, frantic smile. She practically lunged forward to wrap her arms around me. I immediately took a firm step backward, letting the heavy wooden door shield half of my body. My mother stumbled slightly, grasping the heavy baking dish to stop it from falling to the floor. Her fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. She laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound that echoed down the quiet hallway. She told me she was just so excited to see her baby girl and that they had been worried sick about me driving home in the dark last night. My father stepped up behind her, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. He looked at me with a stern, expectant expression, demanding to know why I had ignored 85 phone calls. He told me that families should never treat each other with such disrespect, and that I had caused my mother a sleepless night. I stared at him, taking in the sheer magnitude of his hypocrisy. 3 years ago, when my rent was increased and I asked him for a small short-term loan, he told me that struggle builds character and ignored my calls for a week. Now he was lecturing me about family respect because he knew my bank account had 9 zeros in it. Before I could respond, Chloe pushed her way past our parents and breezed right into my apartment. She did not ask for permission. She simply invaded my space, walking into the center of my living room and looking around with wide, enthusiastic eyes. She ran her hand over the back of my affordable sofa and loudly proclaimed how much she had always loved my cozy little space. Just 24 hours ago, she had called my apartment a depressing shoebox that smelled like cheap takeout. Now she was treating it like a luxury penthouse. Chloe spun around and grabbed my hands, squeezing them tightly. She told me we needed to go shopping immediately. She said she knew a private stylist in Buckhead who could completely upgrade my wardrobe and asked if she could borrow my vintage leather jacket for her upcoming cruise. The greed was practically radiating off her skin. Then Chad made his entrance. He did not wait to be invited. He strode through the front door carrying a sleek black leather briefcase like he was entering a corporate boardroom. He walked directly to my kitchen island and dropped the briefcase onto the marble counter with a loud, commanding thud. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and rested his hands on his hips, looking around my apartment with a deeply serious expression. He clapped his hands together and announced that it was time to get down to business. He told me he was thrilled about my lucky break, but that we were facing a massive financial crisis. Chad started pacing back and forth across my kitchen floor. He immediately launched into a highly rehearsed pitch designed to terrify me. He loudly mansplained that 70% of lottery winners go completely bankrupt within 5 years. He threw out terms like capital gains tax brackets, liability exposure, and predatory litigation. He warned me that the moment my name went public, every single scam artist and distant relative would come crawling out of the woodwork to sue me for everything I owned. He told me that as a young black woman, with no formal financial education, the system would chew me up and spit me out. He stopped pacing and looked at me with deep fake sincerity. He said I desperately needed a professional wealth manager to shield my assets and build a generational portfolio. He positioned himself as my absolute savior. I stood perfectly still, letting him talk, while I observed every single detail of his physical appearance. Chad wanted to project the image of a highly successful financial titan, but his body language told a completely different story. His hands were trembling slightly as he gestured. A thin layer of sweat coated his forehead and upper lip despite the cool temperature in my apartment. He was sweating through the underarms of his expensive-looking dress shirt. As he reached up to wipe his forehead, the sleeve of his jacket pulled back, revealing a heavy gold luxury watch. I knew watches. I had designed a digital interface for a high-end horology brand 2 years ago. I watched the gold second hand on Chad's wrist ticking forward in sharp, distinct jumps. A genuine luxury automatic watch has a smooth, continuous sweeping motion. The loud ticking meant a cheap quartz movement was inside. Chad was wearing a high-end counterfeit watch. His suit jacket also had a slight fray near the bottom hem. He was drowning. The crypto market crash had clearly wiped him out, and my $130 million was his only lifeline to avoid total ruin. Chad popped the latches on his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slapped them down on the marble island. He told me this contract would give him full power of attorney to manage my newly formed LLC. He promised to personally handle all the investments and protect my assets from the government. He said all I had to do was sit back, relax, and enjoy my money. He claimed he would only take a standard 10% management fee to keep everything in the family. 10% of my winnings was $13 million. He was attempting to legally rob me blind right in my own kitchen. I did not yell. I did not kick him out. If I rejected them now, they would just keep harassing me. I needed to trap them in a game they did not even know they were playing. I took a deep breath, let my shoulders drop, and forced my face to look incredibly overwhelmed and scared. I looked at Chad with wide, naive eyes. I told him he was absolutely right, and that I was completely terrified. I said I knew nothing about taxes or trusts, and that I desperately needed my family to guide me. The entire energy in the room shifted. Valerie beamed with triumph. Marcus nodded his head in proud approval. Chloe actually clapped her hands together in delight. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken my spirit and secured their massive payout. I walked over to the kitchen island and told Chad I absolutely wanted him to be my wealth manager. But I explained that the legal firm who helped me set up the blind trust required a standard preliminary signature before I could legally sign over power of attorney to an outside party. I reached into a nearby drawer and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper I had printed earlier that morning. I slid the paper across the marble counter directly over his contract. I handed him my favorite pen. I asked him to just sign this basic client onboarding form for my records so we could get started. Chad was so blinded by his own greed and the promise of a $13 million payday that he did not even bother to read the header on the page. He eagerly snatched the pen from my hand and scribbled his signature on the dotted line. He handed the pen back to me with a triumphant, arrogant grin, telling me we were going to make a great team. I took the document from the counter and smiled genuinely for the first time that entire day. I looked down at his signature. Chad had not signed a client intake form. He had just legally bound himself to an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, drafted by one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in Atlanta, which carried an immediate $10 million penalty for discussing any aspect of my finances. Chad snapped his briefcase shut with a loud, arrogant click. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit, making sure to flash that fake luxury watch one more time, and gave me a condescending wink. He told me I had just made the smartest decision of my entire life and promised to send over the official asset transfer paperwork by morning. My mother swooped in for a suffocating hug, whispering how incredibly proud she was that we were finally acting like a real family again. Chloe practically skipped out the door, already loudly dreaming about the expensive designer clothes she fully assumed I would be funding. I stood completely still and let them walk away. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut, the terrified, overwhelmed expression vanished from my face entirely. I walked over to the marble counter, picked up the signed non-disclosure agreement, and carefully placed it into my leather tote bag. I did not have time to sit around my apartment playing the victim. I had a real business to run. 30 minutes later, I stepped out of a private secure elevator and onto the top floor of a premium Midtown Atlanta high-rise. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the city skyline. Sleek glass walls separated high-tech conference rooms, and dozens of brilliant developers and designers were busy working at modern standing desks. This was my actual office. My family honestly believed I was running a failing app design hobby out of a dingy shared co-working space or my cramped bedroom. They had absolutely no idea that my tech agency had been pulling in 7 figures for the last 3 years. I kept my professional life completely separated from them to protect my peace, and seeing their predatory behavior this morning proved exactly why that total secrecy was necessary. I walked past my executive assistant, grabbed a fresh cup of coffee, and stepped into my private corner office. Waiting for me at the large glass desk was Vance. Vance was a former forensic accountant turned ruthless private investigator. He was the exact kind of man you hire when you need to find the dark money people are desperately trying to hide. I had contacted him the very second I secured my lottery winnings in the blind trust. I used a fraction of my new wealth to put him on a massive retainer. I needed him to dig deep into the Washington family finances because Chad, sweating through his tailored suit this morning, told me everything I needed to know. Wealthy, secure men do not panic. Desperate, broke men panic. Vance did not waste any time with polite pleasantries. He took a slow sip of his black coffee and dropped a massive, heavily tabbed manila folder onto my glass desk. He looked at me with a grim, serious expression and asked if I was ready to see the ugly reality behind the perfect family portrait. I nodded and opened the file. Vance started laying out the paper trail, and every single document was a staggering revelation. He pointed to a series of highlighted bank statements and asked me to confirm that I had been paying my own way since I turned 18. I told him yes. I explained how my parents sat me down the day after my high school graduation and explicitly told me they could not afford to co-sign a basic student loan for my state college tuition. They claimed they were financially tapped out and coldly told me that struggling would build my character. I worked triple shifts waiting tables and coded websites until 3 in the morning just to survive and pay my rent. Vance tapped a heavily highlighted bank record. He calmly informed me that during the exact same year my parents refused to help me buy used college textbooks. They took out a massive secret personal loan to purchase Chloe a brand new luxury BMW for her college graduation. I stared at the numbers on the page as a cold, sickening wave of realization washed over me. Vance kept talking, pulling out more and more damning documents. He showed me the exact receipts for Chloe and her perfect lifestyle. My parents had been secretly funding her entire existence through a massive, tangled web of high-interest loans and maxed-out credit cards. They paid for her designer bags, her lavish European vacations, and covered the outrageous cost of her extravagant wedding to Chad. They bled their own retirement assets completely dry to maintain the absolute illusion that their golden child was a massive financial success. I felt a bitter laugh escape my throat. I asked Vance about Chad. I wanted to know the absolute truth about the great financial wizard who had just stood in my kitchen and generously offered to save me from bankruptcy. Vance leaned back in his leather chair and gave a sharp, humorless smile. He told me that Chad was not a wealth manager. Chad was a desperate con artist running a rapidly sinking ship. Vance leaned forward and tapped the thick folder on my desk, delivering the final crushing blows. He told me to look at the red tab in the folder. I flipped the page and stared at an official, highly sensitive bank document. My parents' sprawling suburban home, the very same house where they had humiliated me on Thanksgiving, was in active foreclosure. The bank had firmly rejected their last 3 frantic appeals and was mere days away from legally seizing the property. Then Vance dropped the second bomb. He handed me a confidential legal briefing. Chad and his cryptocurrency firm were completely insolvent. But worse than being entirely broke, the firm was currently under active federal investigation for massive wire fraud and embezzlement. Chad was not trying to protect my new portfolio. He was desperately trying to steal my lottery winnings to pay off his defrauded investors before the federal government threw him in prison. They did not come to my apartment this morning because they loved me. They came because their entire fake world was collapsing, and they thought I was dumb enough to be their bailout. I stared at the bright red foreclosure notice in Vance's file for a very long time. The great Washington family empire, the untouchable dynasty of perfection and superiority, was nothing but a fragile house of cards waiting for a strong breeze. That breeze was me. The sheer audacity of their performance in my apartment earlier made my blood run completely cold. They were completely destitute. They were drowning in debt and facing potential federal prison time, yet they still had the nerve to march into my home and demand I hand over my fortune under the guise of financial protection. The very next morning, my phone buzzed with a new message from my mother. It was Sunday. The text was sickly sweet, inviting me to join them at the family pew for morning service. She claimed she just wanted us to pray together as a family and thank God for my recent blessings. She said it was time to put the past behind us and focus on the future. I knew exactly what this was. It was a highly orchestrated social ambush. I closed the file on my desk and smiled. I texted her back, telling her I would be absolutely delighted to attend. Greater Zion Cathedral was not just a typical church. It was the absolute epicenter of Atlanta's affluent Black elite. It was a sprawling modern campus of glass and steel where the offering plates were digital and the massive parking lot looked like a luxury car dealership. My mother practically lived for her social status within these walls. She was on the building committee, the hospitality board, and the pastoral support team. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being perceived as a wealthy, generous pillar of this specific community. I dressed impeccably for the occasion. I chose a tailored emerald green designer suit that screamed quiet, sophisticated wealth. When I walked down the center aisle to join my family, my mother beamed with predatory pride. She gripped my hand tightly, pulling me into the heavily cushioned pew. Chad and Chloe were sitting right beside her, looking incredibly tense but highly expectant. They genuinely thought religion and community pressure were the perfect keys to unlocking my bank account. They thought I would revert back to the quiet, obedient scapegoat the second I stepped into their territory. Pastor Sterling took the brightly lit stage. He was a highly charismatic man wearing a custom $3,000 suit who specialized heavily in prosperity gospel. His entire ministry revolved around the concept of financial seeds and miraculous harvests. Midway through his booming sermon about giving back to the community, he suddenly paused and looked directly at our family pew. He smiled broadly, the stage lights catching his expensive watch, and invited my mother up to the altar. My mother strutted up the carpeted steps and grabbed the microphone with practiced dramatic ease. She put on the absolute performance of a lifetime. She cried genuine-looking tears as she spoke passionately about how God had miraculously touched our family this week. She announced to 3,000 captive people that her youngest daughter had been blessed with a historic, unprecedented financial windfall. The crowd gasped and murmured excitedly. Then my mother dropped the heavy hammer she had been planning all along. She boldly proclaimed that to honor God and secure our family legacy, I would be writing a massive 7-figure check to fully fund the new Greater Zion Community Annex. The entire congregation erupted into a deafening standing ovation. People were cheering, raising their hands, and shouting, "Hallelujah!" The organist hit a triumphant chord. My mother turned to me with a brilliant, terrifying smile and extended her hand, beckoning me to join her on the altar. It was an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare. If I said no, I would look like a greedy, ungrateful sinner in front of the entire elite community my mother worshipped. If I said yes, my mother would regain total control of my money and instantly funnel it straight to Pastor Sterling, who I knew for a fact took a heavy personal percentage of the building fund. I calmly stood up and walked up the carpeted steps. I did not shrink. I did not look intimidated or trapped. I smiled warmly, radiating absolute confidence, and took the microphone gently out of my mother's trembling hand. I looked out at the massive sea of faces waiting on my every word. I told them my mother was absolutely right. I stated clearly that I had been blessed beyond measure, and that to whom much is given, much is definitely required. The crowd cheered again, clapping loudly. I turned to look directly at Pastor Sterling and then locked eyes with my mother. I raised my voice so it echoed perfectly through the massive state-of-the-art sound system. I announced that instead of funding a brick-and-mortar building, I was investing directly into the actual people. I proudly declared the immediate launch of the Maya Washington Future Founders Initiative. It was a fully independent tech grant, providing full-ride college scholarships, advanced coding boot camps, and seed money exclusively for young Black women in our very own community. I made sure to speak very clearly and deliberately. I stated that to maximize this incredible blessing and ensure absolutely zero administrative overhead, the entire multi-million-dollar fund would be managed exclusively through my own private trust, completely bypassing the church financial office entirely. I told the congregation that I wanted these brilliant young women to learn true financial independence, so they would never ever have to rely on anyone else to secure their future or validate their worth. The young people sitting in the balcony completely lost their minds, cheering and applauding wildly. The older congregation quickly joined in, deeply moved by the powerful message of education and female empowerment. It was a massive, undeniable public relations victory for me. But on the altar, the atmosphere was absolutely toxic. Pastor Sterling looked like he had just swallowed a mouthful of crushed glass. His fake, polished smile was frozen tightly on his face as he realized millions of dollars had just slipped right through his greedy fingers. But my mother was the main event. Valerie Washington stood completely paralyzed. Her hands hung limply at her sides, and her face had drained of all color. She had brought me up here to publicly trap me into handing over my wealth to save her own sinking reputation and fund her social climbing. She had likely promised the pastor a massive cut to secure her own VIP status in the church hierarchy. Now she had to stand on a brightly lit stage in front of 3,000 of her peers and pretend to be thrilled that her daughter had just publicly cut her out of the equation entirely. I handed the microphone back to the pastor and gave my mother a soft, knowing smile. I leaned in close to her ear while the crowd continued to roar. I whispered that she always taught me to be smart with my investments. Camera low-angle tracking shot following Chad as he confidently strides into Maya's office building expecting a dump. The heavy revolving glass doors of the Midtown high-rise parted smoothly as Chad marched into the sleek marble lobby. He wore a freshly pressed navy suit, and carried that same worn leather briefcase, projecting the aggressive, unearned confidence of a man who believed the entire world owed him a massive favor. I watched his arrival on the live security feed from my penthouse suite. He approached the polished concierge desk with a condescending smirk, clearly expecting to be directed to some cramped, windowless co-working basement or a shared cubicle. Instead, the uniformed receptionist verified his identity, handed him a platinum-embossed VIP guest keycard, and pointed him toward the private executive elevators reserved exclusively for the top floors. When the brushed silver doors slid open on the 30th floor, Chad stepped out and completely froze. His arrogant, aggressive stride died instantly. He found himself standing in the center of a sprawling, multi-million-dollar UI/UX tech agency. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire perimeter of the building, flooding the open concept space with natural sunlight and offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. Dozens of brilliant developers, software engineers, and senior designers moved purposefully between sleek glass-walled conference rooms and high-tech collaborative workspaces. Authentic Herman Miller chairs lined the custom oak desks, and massive curved monitors displayed complex coding architecture. This was not a cute little hobby or a side hustle to pay rent. This was a highly lucrative corporate fortress, and Chad was standing right in the middle of an empire he had no idea existed. I watched through the soundproof glass of my corner office as he slowly processed the reality of my absolute success. The condescending smirk melted off his face, replaced by a sudden sickening realization that he had drastically underestimated me for over a decade. He tugged nervously at his silk collar and adjusted his fake luxury watch before marching toward my door. He did not bother knocking or waiting for my executive assistant to announce him. He simply pushed the heavy glass door open and strode in, attempting to desperately reclaim his shattered authority in a room where he had absolutely none. He dropped his briefcase onto my custom obsidian desk and leaned over it, trying to physically intimidate me with his height. He let out a loud, forced laugh and told me my little church stunt yesterday was a cute piece of theatrical drama, but that playtime was officially over. He said I had embarrassed my mother enough in front of her friends, and now it was time to let the adults handle the real business. He snapped the latches of his briefcase open and pulled out a single sheet of paper containing wire transfer instructions. He tapped the paper aggressively with his index finger and demanded I immediately authorize a $10 million transfer to his wealth management firm to secure my portfolio before the market opened. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and simply looked at him. I asked him why he needed $10 million wired on a random Monday morning without a single piece of formal investment documentation, a strategic prospectus, or a clear risk assessment. Chad slammed his hands down on the edge of my desk. His face flushed an angry, mottled red. He launched into a vicious, deeply offensive tirade. He leaned in close, his voice dripping with venom, and told me I was completely out of my depth. He said that winning the lottery did not make me a financial genius, and that coding websites was absolute child's play compared to the complex realities of global asset management. Then he played the exact manipulative card I knew he would. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that the high finance sector is a ruthless shark tank designed to tear people exactly like me apart. He boldly stated that as a young black woman with sudden massive wealth, I was a walking target for the IRS predatory litigation and old money institutions that would happily bleed me dry. He sneered and said the corporate world would eat me alive unless I had a white man standing in the room to legitimize my capital and negotiate on my behalf. He positioned himself as my mandatory shield, claiming I would be entirely bankrupt within a single year if I did not put him in total control of my assets right this very second. I kept my expression perfectly blank. I let the absolute silence stretch out, allowing his racist, misogynistic garbage to hang heavily in the cold air between us. I casually picked up a sleek metal pen and twirled it slowly between my fingers. I looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes and asked him why his firm was the safest place for my money. I gently pushed him, asking if his internal accounts were truly secure and why he was pressing so incredibly hard for immediate liquid capital when my funds were already perfectly safe in a blind trust. Chad threw his arms up in exasperation, entirely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to assert total dominance over me. He loudly scoffed and told me I did not understand how corporate liquidity and leverage actually worked. He paced aggressively across the floor of my office and boasted that his crypto firm was just facing a temporary transitional shortfall. He snapped that his institutional investors were demanding immediate returns, and he desperately needed my $10 million to cover the spread before a scheduled federal audit next week. He waved his hand dismissively, claiming it was just a standard Wall Street practice to move capital around to keep the feds off his back. He explicitly stated that his firm was currently completely insolvent, but my money would patch the massive hole and make us both incredibly rich once the market inevitably rebounded. He stopped pacing and pointed a trembling, sweaty finger at me, demanding I sign the wire transfer before the banks closed for the day. He thought he had me cornered. He honestly believed his aggressive bullying and toxic fear-mongering had broken my spirit just like it always worked on my parents. He thought his intimidation tactics had paralyzed me into total submission. I smiled warmly, set my pen down, and reached into the top drawer of my desk. I pulled out my secondary smartphone and tapped the glowing screen to stop the active high-definition voice recording. I set the phone right next to his ridiculous wire transfer document. I looked up at Chad and watched the blood completely drain from his face as the sheer horror of the realization hit him. He had just stormed into my private office and loudly confessed to operating an insolvent firm, running a fraudulent Ponzi scheme, and planning to embezzle $10 million to hide his financial crimes from a federal audit. I looked at his shaking hands and told him he was absolutely right about one thing. The financial world is a shark tank, but I was not the bleeding bait. I was the apex predator. Chad snatched his hands back from the sleek glass desk as if the smooth surface had suddenly caught fire. The arrogant, aggressive swagger completely vanished from his posture in a fraction of a second. He opened his mouth to shout, to hurl another vicious barrage of insults, but the words died instantly in his throat. $10 million penalty. That was the absolute binding legal reality of the document he had just blindly signed in his desperate, frantic rush for cash. He stared at the signature line with wide, terrified eyes. He grabbed his cheap leather briefcase, spun around, and practically sprinted toward the glass doors of my executive suite. He did not look back. I sat perfectly still and watched his retreating figure step into the private elevator, completely destroyed by his own toxic greed. Camera 360-degree circling shot around Maya as she negotiates on the phone with Wall Street executives. I did not waste a single second celebrating the small victory. I walked straight back to my desk, picked up my secure phone, and initiated a three-way conference call with Vance and my lead corporate attorney. The game was no longer about simple self-defense or proving a point to my toxic family. It was about total, absolute financial dismantling. Chad wanted to play the ruthless Wall Street tycoon and lecture me about the realities of high finance, so I decided to show him exactly how that game was actually played by the big leagues. Vance had already compiled the entire comprehensive list of distressed creditors holding the massive, heavy bags of debt from Chad's failing cryptocurrency firm. The list was a chaotic, tangled mess of angry private equity lenders, leveraged margin callers, and panicked institutional investors who were desperately trying to offload the toxic assets before the federal fraud investigation became public knowledge. They were bleeding cash by the hour and aggressively looking for any possible exit strategy to save their own reputations. I instructed my legal team to rapidly approach every single major creditor on that specific list. I was not going to fight Chad with angry words or emotional family drama. I was going to crush him with cold, hard, liquid capital. I paced around my corner office, listening to the intense negotiations unfold in real time over the speakerphone. The Wall Street executives on the other end of the line were completely stunned by our sudden, unsolicited offer. They assumed Chad's fraudulent firm was completely dead in the water and their money was permanently lost. My lawyers moved with terrifying surgical precision. We offered to buy up the massive toxic debt portfolios for absolute pennies on the dollar. A few of the executives hesitated, trying to arrogantly negotiate for a slightly higher percentage. But I leaned directly into the microphone and delivered a sharp, flat ultimatum. I told them they could either take my immediate cash buyout right this very second, or they could wait for the federal indictment to hit next week and lose absolutely everything they had invested. They folded instantly. Within 4 hours, the massive wire transfers cleared securely through my blind trust. The complex legal documents were rapidly drafted, digitally signed, and securely filed with the proper financial authorities. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and stared at the final confirmation screens lighting up my monitor. I did not just have basic leverage over Chad anymore. I legally owned every single major financial obligation tied to his fraudulent failing company. I was officially his primary absolute creditor. If he missed a single scheduled payment, if he tried to move a single hidden asset, or if he dared to file for bankruptcy protection without my explicit legal consent, I had the absolute legal authority to seize everything he owned. I could immediately seize his fake luxury cars, his frozen bank accounts, and the very sprawling suburban house my parents had mortgaged their souls to protect. I held the permanent keys to his entire existence. My family had spent my entire life treating me like a pathetic, naive child who constantly needed to be managed and controlled. They genuinely thought wealth was defined by loud designer labels, exclusive country club memberships, and arrogant bragging at the Thanksgiving dinner table. They had absolutely no concept of actual systemic power. Real wealth moves in total silence. Real wealth does not need to scream in a hallway or violently bang on an apartment door. Real wealth simply buys the very ground you are standing on and waits patiently for you to notice the sudden change in gravity. I picked up my personal cell phone. The screen was still completely flooded with unread, frantic messages from my mother and sister begging me to call them back and demanding to know why Chad was suddenly ignoring all of their calls. They were rapidly spiraling, completely losing their grip on the narrative they had controlled for decades. It was finally time to pull them all together into one single room. I opened our main family group chat. I completely ignored every single one of their previous manipulative messages and typed out a short, simple text. Let us celebrate my win. Dinner at Chop's Lobster Bar Saturday night. My treat. The reaction was almost instantaneous. 3 typing bubbles appeared simultaneously on the glowing screen. My mother replied first, flooding the chat with heart emojis, and loudly praising God that I was finally acting like a proper Washington. Chloe immediately chimed in, declaring she would book a professional blowout, and fully expected me to order the most expensive champagne on the menu to celebrate her sister. Even my father sent a rare thumbs-up emoji, confirming his prompt attendance. They eagerly swallowed the bait whole, completely blinded by the promise of an expensive free meal and the delusional, arrogant hope that they could still manipulate me into funding their collapsing lives. They were eagerly planning their expensive outfits and practicing their fake supportive speeches. They had absolutely no idea they were happily walking directly into a trap that they could never escape. Camera. Slow push-in on Maya getting dressed for the dinner. She puts on a bespoke suit looking like a billionaire. Handheld shots show her family getting ready, greedily discussing what they will order. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my penthouse suite, running a lint roller over the lapels of my custom Tom Ford suit. The midnight blue silk blend fabric draped perfectly over my frame, projecting an aura of cold, unyielding authority. I slipped a vintage Cartier watch onto my wrist, the heavy gold resting against my skin like a sleek suit of armor. I slowly adjusted my cuffs and stared at my own reflection. Tonight was not a family reunion or a casual dinner to mend broken fences. It was a highly orchestrated corporate execution. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself into small corners to make them comfortable, deliberately hiding my brilliance so Chloe could shine, and swallowing my pride so my parents could maintain their fragile illusions of superiority. That era was permanently over. Across town in their heavily mortgaged suburban McMansion, the atmosphere was a chaotic mix of delusional excitement and sheer terror. Chloe was practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. She sat at her mirrored vanity, aggressively applying setting spray while scrolling through a digital catalog of luxury vehicles on her tablet. She excitedly babbled loud enough for the entire house to hear about the customized interior options for a brand new Mercedes G-Class. She confidently declared that since I had publicly embarrassed the family at the church yesterday, I would obviously be overcompensating with massive financial apology gifts tonight. She added a Porsche Panamera to her digital cart, loudly debating which color would look best in their driveway. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was currently locked inside their master bathroom, dry heaving over the marble sink. Chad had not spoken a single word about his disastrous visit to my office. He had not told her about his recorded confession or the catastrophic reality that I now personally owned the toxic debt of his fraudulent firm. He was trapped in a living nightmare, completely paralyzed by the knowledge that walking into that restaurant tonight meant facing his absolute destruction. He splashed freezing water on his pale, sweating face, terrified of what I was about to do. In the master suite of the Washington family home, the air was thick with desperate, frantic energy. My father, Marcus, was struggling to tie his silk Windsor knot, his hands shaking with barely suppressed panic. He sharply reminded my mother that the bank had sent the final notice of default by registered mail that very morning. They had exactly 48 hours before the foreclosure became public record, and the county sheriff arrived to begin the eviction process. Valerie aggressively powdered her neck, entirely dismissing his rising panic with a sharp wave of her hand. She confidently adjusted her diamond tennis necklace and told him to stop sweating like a commoner. She was absolutely convinced that my dinner invitation was a white flag of surrender. She told Marcus that my little charity stunt at the church was just a temporary act of rebellion, and that I was desperate to be welcomed back into the prestigious family fold. She explicitly instructed him to let her do all the talking tonight. She outlined a predatory psychological strategy to guilt-trip me into paying off their secret $500,000 balloon payment under the guise of an early inheritance tax strategy. They were already spending my money in their minds, completely blinded by their own towering arrogance. I stepped out of my chauffeur-driven town car and handed the valet a crisp $100 bill. Chop's Lobster Bar was the undisputed crown jewel of Atlanta's elite dining scene, a dark wood and brass establishment where massive corporate mergers were routinely negotiated over dry-aged Wagyu and $1,000 bottles of Cabernet. The general manager rushed past a line of waiting patrons the second I walked through the heavy mahogany doors. He greeted me by name with extreme deference and immediately escorted me past the crowded main dining room. I had not just reserved a table for my family. I had leveraged my newly acquired corporate influence to completely buy out the restaurant's premium private back dining suite for the entire evening. Heavy velvet curtains separated the VIP room from the rest of the bustling establishment. A massive polished oak table sat in the center of the room, impeccably set with fine crystal and heavy silver flatware. I took my seat at the absolute head of the table, adjusting my suit jacket and waiting in the quiet, luxurious silence. But I was not the only person waiting. In the adjoining private tasting lounge, separated only by a set of closed frosted glass French doors, sat the special guests I had specifically requested for this evening. I could see their imposing silhouettes through the frosted glass and hear the soft clinking of ice against crystal tumblers as they quietly enjoyed top-shelf bourbon. They were completely hidden from view, but perfectly positioned to hear every single word that was about to be spoken. My family was eagerly driving across town, expecting a free luxury meal and a naive daughter ready to blindly hand over her newly acquired fortune. They had absolutely no idea the stage was perfectly set for their total and inescapable ruin. The heavy frosted glass doors of the VIP suite swung open, and my family spilled into the private dining room like a pack of starving wolves disguised in evening wear. My mother immediately took control of the space, complaining loudly to the maitre d' about the valet service while simultaneously eyeing the crystal chandeliers with obvious hungry approval. Marcus trailed behind her, straightening his silk tie and puffing out his chest, trying to project the image of a seasoned, untouchable patriarch. Chloe practically skipped to the table, her eyes already scanning the gold-embossed menus with undisguised greed. And then there was Chad. He looked like a man walking directly to the executioner's block. His face was covered in a thin, slick sheen of nervous sweat, and his eyes darted frantically around the room, avoiding my gaze at all costs. He immediately signaled a passing waiter and ordered a double Scotch neat, downing the amber liquid the second it arrived. He was absolutely terrified, but trapped by his own deception, unable to warn my family without exposing himself as a total fraud. Camera gliding across the lavish dining table. Close-ups on the expensive seafood Wagyu beef and $2,000 bottles of wine. They ordered with reckless, aggressive abandon. Chloe did not even bother glancing at the prices. She demanded the Grand Imperial Seafood Tower loaded with Maine lobster tails, Alaskan king crab claws, and fresh beluga caviar imported daily. My mother summoned the sommelier with a snap of her fingers and confidently pointed to a rare vintage Bordeaux that cost over $2,000 a bottle. Marcus requested the dry-aged Japanese A5 Wagyu beef, specifically asking the chef to top it with shaved white truffles and 24-carat edible gold flakes. Chad kept the alcohol flowing, ordering round after round of top-shelf whiskey, like he was desperately trying to erase his own memory. I sat quietly at the head of the long oak table, ordering a simple mixed green salad and a glass of sparkling water. I watched them gorge themselves on absolute luxury, entirely fueled by the delusion that my bank account was their personal limitless credit card. Chloe leaned across the table, waving a silver oyster fork in my direction. She loudly announced that since I was suddenly rolling in lottery cash, it was only fair that I upgrade her upcoming Mediterranean anniversary cruise. She started listing her demands with shameless, unearned entitlement. She wanted the owner's suite a private balcony with a personal jacuzzi and upgraded first-class airfare for both her and Chad. She giggled and casually mentioned she had already reserved a brand-new Porsche Panamera earlier that afternoon and fully expected me to cover the financing by Monday morning. She spoke about my money as if it was communal property, acting as if my sole purpose on this earth was to automatically fund her extravagant lifestyle. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and smiled, telling her it sounded like a lovely trip. The excessive alcohol finally hit Chad's system, loosening his tongue and temporarily overriding his sheer terror. He slurred his words slightly as he leaned back in his tufted leather chair, trying to desperately reconstruct his shattered ego in front of his in-laws. He pointed a sweaty finger at me and loudly slurred that I was incredibly lucky to have him in the family. He puffed out his chest, playing his usual arrogant role for Marcus and Valerie, boasting endlessly about his financial wizardry. He promised that if I just wired him my entire portfolio, he would magically multiply my wealth within 6 months. He claimed his cryptocurrency investments were generating historic, unprecedented returns, and that he was the only man in Atlanta capable of protecting my new assets. It was a pathetic, desperate performance from a man who knew his entire empire was completely dead, and that I personally held the murder weapon. I rested my elbows on the polished table and looked directly into his bloodshot eyes. I asked him in a sweet, innocent tone if his firm was truly doing that well. I mentioned that I had read some recent articles about extreme volatility in the crypto market and asked if his institutional investors were feeling secure. Chad swallowed hard, a fresh bead of sweat rolling down his temple. He lied through his teeth, loudly proclaiming that his firm was wealthier and more secure than ever before, and that he was actively turning away new investors because he had far too much capital to manage. I shifted my gaze to my parents. They were happily tearing into their gold flake Wagyu beef, completely oblivious to the suffocating tension radiating off Chad. I asked them how the suburban house was holding up. I gently inquired if they were comfortable or if they ever felt financially burdened by the massive upkeep of such a sprawling estate. My mother laughed, a sharp, condescending sound. She wiped her mouth with a linen napkin and told me not to worry my little head about their sophisticated finances. She claimed they owned the massive property free and clear and that their investment portfolio was generating record-breaking profits. She looked me dead in the eye and stated they were wealthier and more stable than they had ever been in their entire lives. Every single word out of their mouths was a verifiable, documented lie. They sat there gorging themselves on a feast they could never afford, pretending to be royalty, while their entire lives were actively crumbling to ash. I let them finish their extravagant meal, listening to them excitedly outline exactly how they planned to spend my money. When the final plates were cleared, the atmosphere in the room was thick with bloated satisfaction. They leaned back in their chairs, smiling greedily, and waiting for me to pull out my card and thank them for the privilege of buying their dinner. The heavy suite doors opened, and the head waiter entered holding a thick black leather folio. He bypassed me entirely and walked straight down the length of the table. Following my explicit secret instructions, he placed the final bill directly in front of Chad. It was a staggering $12,000. Camera fast whip pans between Chad's sweating face, Valerie's confusion, and Maya's ice-cold smirk. The heavy leather folio landed on the polished oak table with a soft, definitive thud. The sound was barely audible over the ambient jazz playing through the hidden speakers, but to Chad it might as well have been a thunderclap. He stared at the discreet gold lettering on the cover, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Valerie frowned, her heavily powdered brow furrowing in deep confusion as her eyes darted between the waiter and her son-in-law. She opened her mouth to correct the staff member, assuming it was a simple service error, but the words died on her lips when she saw my face. I sat perfectly still, offering them nothing but an ice-cold, unrelenting smirk. Chad let out a sharp, forced laugh that sounded more like a choke. He reached out with trembling fingers and slid the leather checkbook across the smooth expanse of the table toward me. He pasted on a sickly, pale grin that did not reach his terrified eyes. "Your treat, right, little sis? You are the one rolling in the big bucks now. Time to pay up and show us how well you are doing." He pushed the folio until it rested precisely an inch from my untouched water glass. Chloe aggressively nodded in agreement, her diamond earrings catching the light as she crossed her arms. She smugly demanded that I stop playing games and hand over my card so they could get back to discussing her new Porsche. Marcus casually swirled his $2,000 Bordeaux, completely expecting me to eagerly fund their excessive gluttony. I did not reach for my designer purse. I did not move a single muscle to retrieve a credit card. Instead, I slowly reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small rectangular slip of paper. It was the scratched $3 lottery ticket, the exact same cheap piece of paper they had relentlessly mocked me for, the same ticket they had arrogantly assumed was the pathetic source of my sudden wealth. I held it between my index and middle finger, letting them stare at it for a long, agonizing moment. Then I deliberately dropped it right on top of the black leather billfold. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table and lacing my fingers together. I kept my voice low, calm, and absolutely terrifying. My money is securely locked inside a blind trust. The legal parameters are incredibly strict, and I simply do not have access to any immediate liquidity tonight. I paused, letting the terrifying reality of my words sink into their alcohol-soaked brains. "But hey, Chad, you are the brilliant, successful wealth manager of the family. You have been bragging all night about your historic, unprecedented returns. You can certainly cover a $12,000 dinner, right?" The silence that fell over the table was absolute. The air in the private suite suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. Chloe let out a sharp, offended gasp, her eyes darting from the cheap lottery ticket to my face. She violently smacked the table, demanding that I stop making humiliating jokes in front of the waitstaff. Valerie clutched her pearl necklace, her face flushing with indignant rage, as she sharply ordered me to stop embarrassing the family and pay the bill immediately. I simply smiled and gestured toward Chad. "I am completely serious, Mother. I do not have the funds available tonight." But Chad is a titan of industry. He literally just told us he turns away investors because he has too much capital. 12 grand is pocket change for a man of his stature. Marcus turned his heavy, expectant gaze toward his son-in-law. He adjusted his suit jacket and loudly agreed with me, stating that a true man of wealth should naturally host the family celebration. He practically commanded Chad to handle the check and prove his financial dominance. Chad was completely boxed in, He could not admit to Marcus and Valerie that his firm was a fraudulent, collapsing shell. He could not admit to Chloe that her precious luxury life was entirely funded by toxic debt. His massive, fragile ego forced him to maintain the lie even as the walls closed in around him. Sweat poured freely down Chad's face, ruining the collar of his expensive dress shirt. His hands shook violently as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy metal black card. He did not look at me. He refused to make eye contact with anyone at the table. He practically shoved the card at the waiting server, giving a weak, dismissive wave, as if the transaction was a minor annoyance. The waiter offered a polite nod and silently backed out of the room. Chloe immediately resumed her obnoxious chatter, completely missing the impending disaster. She started loudly debating whether she wanted the interior of her new car to be ivory or oxblood leather. Valerie chimed in discussing how they needed to hire a new landscaper for the estate, completely ignoring the reality of their impending foreclosure. They were happily rebuilding their delusions, wrapping themselves back in their fake armor of superiority. I watched Chad. His eyes were wide and unfocused. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, his chest heaving under his suit jacket. He knew exactly what was coming. Less than 3 minutes later, the head waiter returned. He moved with the quiet, discreet professionalism of a man used to handling high society awkwardness. He stepped directly up to Chad and placed the heavy metal card back onto the table. He leaned down and spoke in a low voice that nonetheless carried clearly across the silent room. "I am terribly sorry, sir, but this card has been declined." Chloe stopped talking mid-sentence. Marcus frowned, heavily offended by the very concept of a declined transaction. Chad swallowed hard, a loud gulping sound in the quiet room. He frantically reached into his wallet, pulling out a platinum corporate card and a premium travel card. He aggressively shoved both of them at the waiter, loudly blaming a bank error or a fraud alert triggered by the unusually high dinner bill. His voice cracked as he ordered the man to run them both immediately. The waiter stepped away, and the silence in the room stretched into an agonizing eternity. No one spoke. Chloe stared at her husband with narrow, suspicious eyes. The illusion of his limitless wealth was cracking, and she hated the sudden feeling of embarrassment. Marcus tapped his fingers aggressively against the oak table, his patience entirely gone. Valerie looked between all of us, a creeping sense of dread finally beginning to penetrate her profound arrogance. The waiter returned faster this time. He did not bring a receipt. He did not bring a pen. He placed both cards gently back on the table. The polite customer service mask was gone, replaced by a firm, unyielding expression. "I am afraid both secondary methods of payment have also been declined, sir." Chad shot up from his chair, his face burning bright red. He loudly, aggressively cursed the banking institution, desperately patting his pockets and grabbing his cell phone to check his accounts. He yelled that there had to be a mistake, that he had millions in liquid assets, and that the restaurant's machine must be broken. He demanded to speak to the general manager immediately. The waiter did not flinch. He stood perfectly straight and delivered the final fatal blow with absolute surgical precision. "Sir, there is no issue with our system. Your institution has placed a hard freeze on all associated accounts. Your assets have been legally seized by your primary creditor." The color completely drained from Chad's face, leaving him a sickly, grayish white. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the oak table. The screen lit up, displaying a terrifying sea of red negative balances and bold locked account warnings. He slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. The arrogant swagger, the aggressive posturing, the endless superiority was entirely gone. He finally understood the absolute gravity of the documents he had signed in my office. He finally realized who his primary creditor actually was. I sat back in my chair, took a slow, elegant sip of my sparkling water, and watched his entire world burn to the ground. Chad shattered the silence with a violent, animalistic roar. He slammed both of his fists onto the heavy oak table with such brute force that the fine crystal wine glasses toppled over instantly. A pool of $2,000 Bordeaux bled across the pristine white linen tablecloth like a fresh, gaping wound. He shot up from his chair, his chest heaving heavily under his tailored suit. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face, completely abandoning his polished Wall Street facade. "You rigged this," he screamed, spit flying from his pale lips. "You paid off the general manager to humiliate me. You are a pathetic, ungrateful fraud playing psychotic games because you are jealous of our success. You have always been nothing but a bitter failure, and you will always be nothing." Valerie immediately jumped to his defense, acting on decades of ingrained conditioning to protect the golden child by marriage. She slammed her hand down her diamond rings, clacking sharply against the wood. "Maya fixed this disaster immediately," she shrieked, her face flushing with indignant rage. "I will not have you play these insane, jealous games and ruin our family celebration." Marcus stood up next to her, his face purple with anger, demanding that I hand over my trust fund details and stop this childish, embarrassing tantrum right this second. Chloe was hyperventilating, staring at the declined metal cards on the table, as if they were alien artifacts, completely unable to process the reality unfolding in front of her. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I slowly pushed my ergonomic chair back and stood up to my full height. The sheer freezing authority in my posture instantly silenced the chaotic room. I reached into my sleek leather briefcase resting on the floor beside me. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder bursting with legally binding documents, highlighted bank statements, and federal court filings. I threw it onto the center of the table. It landed right on top of the spilled red wine with a heavy, definitive smack. "Read it, Chad," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a surgical scalpel. "Read it aloud for your adoring loyal in-laws. Let them hear exactly how successful you really are." Chad stared at the saturated folder, his eyes wide with absolute bottomless terror. He refused to touch it. He backed away from the table, shaking his head frantically, muttering that the documents were forged and that I was trying to frame him. Since Chad was suddenly illiterate, I decided to educate the room myself. I looked directly at my father, locking onto his panicked eyes. "Your brilliant, successful son-in-law is completely broke, Dad. He is not a financial genius. He is a desperate, cornered con artist running a collapsing Ponzi scheme." Chloe shrieked, clamping her hands over her ears and violently shaking her head. "You are a liar!" she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "We are buying a private yacht next month. We just put a deposit on a vacation home in Aspen. Stop being so jealous of my life." I ignored her completely, focusing my entire presence on Marcus and Valerie, who were slowly sinking back into their chairs. His cryptocurrency firm has been under active federal investigation for massive wire fraud and embezzlement. For the past 6 months, I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the private suite. The Securities and Exchange Commission froze his primary trading accounts on Tuesday morning. He has been aggressively stealing millions from his new naive investors to quietly pay off his old angry ones, and the stolen money finally ran out completely this morning. Marcus gripped the edge of the oak table, his knuckles turning stark white. He demanded to know how I could possibly have access to highly classified federal financial information. He still desperately clung to the belief that I was just his foolish, naive daughter who lacked the intelligence to comprehend complex corporate structures. "Because I am not just a bystander anymore, Dad," I said, leaning forward and resting my knuckles on the table. "When Chad barged into my private office yesterday, demanding a $50 million bailout from my trust, he blindly signed a corporate non-disclosure agreement with a $10 million penalty clause. I used that precise legal leverage to access his confidential distressed creditor list." Valerie gasped out loud, her hand flying to her throat. She looked at Chad, waiting for him to confidently deny everything, but Chad was staring at the floor, completely broken. She finally realized this was not a prank. "I spent the entire afternoon on the phone with terrified Wall Street executives," I said, detailing the execution. "They were bleeding cash and desperate to offload Chad's toxic, worthless debt before the federal indictments hit the global press next week. So I bought it, all of it, for absolute pennies on the dollar, completely routed and secured through my blind trust." Chad fell back into his chair as if his puppet strings had been permanently cut. He put his head in his hands, letting out a pathetic, broken whimper that sounded entirely inhuman. Chloe grabbed his arm aggressively, shaking him and demanding that he tell me to stop lying, but Chad just continued to sob into his palms. "I am legally your primary creditor, Chad," I stated, savoring the absolute cold finality of the words. I slowly lifted my left wrist and checked the time on my vintage Cartier watch. The gold hands glinted brightly under the crystal chandelier. "In fact, Chad, as your sole majority creditor, I filed the emergency paperwork for the total and immediate liquidation of your assets exactly 2 hours ago. You do not own a single thing anymore. Your customized Porsche Panamera was just towed from the valet stand outside." Camera push in rapidly on Chloe, whose smugness has entirely vanished. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. It lasted for exactly 3 seconds before Chloe finally snapped. She lunged forward, knocking her heavy wooden dining chair backward onto the thick carpet. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You are a monster!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the mahogany-paneled walls. "You are a sick, jealous monster. Mom, Dad, tell her to stop. Make her stop right now." She grabbed Chad by the shoulder, desperately trying to pull him up from his slumped, defeated posture, but he was completely unresponsive. He just kept staring at the declined credit cards lying next to my $3 lottery ticket. Valerie immediately rushed to comfort her golden child. She wrapped her arms around Chloe and shot me a look of pure venom. "Maya, this disgusting charade ends right this second," Valerie hissed. "You are deliberately trying to destroy your sister's marriage because you have always been bitter and alone. Apologize to Chad and give him his car back immediately." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached back into the thick manila folder resting on the table. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not a complex federal indictment or a dense corporate spreadsheet. It was a simple standard bank document printed on heavy official stock. I slid it precisely across the polished oak table. It glided over the spilled red wine and stopped directly in front of my father. "I think we need to have a serious conversation about how your golden child actually funds her flawless lifestyle," I said, keeping my tone completely flat and clinical. "Chloe, you have been bragging all night about your upcoming $14,000 Mediterranean anniversary cruise. You genuinely believed your brilliant husband paid for that luxurious owner's suite with his massive cryptocurrency profits. You thought he was spoiling you because he was a Wall Street titan." Chloe glared at me, her chest heaving. "He is a titan," she spat fiercely. "He is a provider. He takes care of me unlike anyone has ever taken care of you." I gestured toward the document sitting in front of Marcus. "He did not pay for that cruise with his own money, Chloe," I stated cleanly. "He paid for it with Marcus's money. Actually, that is not entirely accurate. He paid for your luxury vacation, your designer handbags, and your constant country club tabs by taking out a high-interest predatory loan using Marcus's personal social security number." The color instantly drained from Marcus's face. He snatched the paper off the table, his hands trembling so violently the page audibly rattled in the quiet room. He adjusted his reading glasses and stared at the bold black ink. I watched comprehension slowly dawn on my father's face. "Chad did not just forge a few checks, Dad," I continued relentlessly. "He completely fabricated your signature and leveraged your remaining equity to secure a massive line of credit for his failing firm. When his investors started demanding their money back, he panicked. He used your identity to steal cash from a high-risk private lender to temporarily cover his tracks and buy his wife expensive distractions." Valerie let go of Chloe and took a stumbling step backward. "Marcus, what is it?" she demanded, her voice suddenly thin and trembling. "What does the paper say?" Marcus could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically across the forged signature line. The massive balloon payment that had been terrifying my parents, the looming foreclosure that had them entirely paralyzed with fear, it all finally made terrifying sense to him. He had spent the last month quietly blaming the economy and bad investments for his sudden lack of liquidity. Now he was holding the undeniable physical proof that his favorite son-in-law had deliberately systematically bled him dry. "Chad, tell them she is lying!" Chloe pleaded, her voice dropping to a desperate, frantic whisper. "Tell them she forged that paper just to make us look bad. Chad, tell them." Chad remained completely silent. He buried his face deeper into his hands, letting out a long, jagged breath. He could not even look at his wife, let alone defend himself. His silence was the loudest confession possible. "You completely ruined us," Marcus whispered, staring at Chad with wide, horrified eyes. "You forged my signature. You took out a loan against the family estate. The bank sent the final default notice this morning. I thought it was a clerical error. I thought my accountant made a mistake. But it was you. You stole everything we had left to buy her a cruise." I leaned back in my chair, observing the absolute wreckage of their carefully curated illusions. They had spent decades treating me like a naive, pathetic outcast, while elevating Chloe and Chad onto an untouchable pedestal of perfection. They had blindly worshipped the appearance of wealth, completely ignoring the rotting, corrupt foundation it was built upon. Now they were forced to look at the golden boy they had chosen over their own flesh and blood. "Your entire life is a fraud, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper. "Every designer dress you wear, every expensive vacation you brag about, every single thing that makes you feel superior to me was bought with stolen money. Your husband is a criminal, and he just dragged our parents down with him." Marcus turned red with rage. The veins in his neck bulged as he dropped the forged loan document back onto the table. He finally realized his golden child and her husband had just ruined his credit, completely destroyed his retirement, and actively pushed him into permanent, inescapable bankruptcy. The heavy frosted glass doors swung open, and the 5 senior members of the Grace Fellowship Church Board of Directors stepped into the private suite. Pastor Thomas stood at the front, his normally warm and welcoming face locked into an expression of sheer horrified disbelief. Beside him, the head of the Financial Oversight Committee clutched a leather portfolio, staring at Valerie, as if he had just witnessed her commit a murder in broad daylight. They had been waiting in the private adjoining lounge exactly as I had arranged, listening to the amplified audio feed I had subtly requested the restaurant staff to activate. Valerie let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. Her hands flew to her face, covering her mouth as she stumbled backward against the wall. The flawless high society matriarch, who had spent the last 20 years judging every other woman in the congregation, was now physically trembling under the devastating weight of their stares. Her designer dress suddenly looked ridiculous, her pearl necklace a costume on a fraud. She tried to speak, to formulate some kind of desperate excuse, but her voice completely failed her. Only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped her throat. Pastor Thomas stepped fully into the room, his eyes scanning the absolute wreckage of my family. He looked at the spilled $2,000 wine, at Chad sweating and hyperventilating in his chair, at Marcus, standing frozen with the forged loan documents in his hand, and finally at the stolen building fund ledgers resting neatly on the table in front of me. "Valerie," he said, his voice heavy with profound sorrow and deep righteous anger. "We received an anonymous tip this afternoon regarding irregularities in the reserve accounts, but we prayed it was a clerical error. We came tonight hoping Maya's generosity could help fund the new youth wing. Instead, we find our head treasurer actively confessing to stealing from the very community she swore to serve." Valerie dropped to her knees. It was not a theatrical performance this time. Her legs simply gave out. She grabbed the edge of the tablecloth, sobbing uncontrollably, begging Pastor Thomas for mercy. She babbled incoherently about how the devil had tempted her, how she was only trying to protect her daughter's fragile marriage, how she had every intention of paying it back with interest. She cried out that she was a good Christian woman who had just made a terrible momentary mistake. The head of the financial committee stepped forward, completely unmoved by her tears. "Wire fraud is not a mistake, Valerie," he stated, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. "It is a calculated felony. You used your security clearance to bypass the dual signature requirement and funneled $45,000 of congregation money into a private offshore account. The police have already been notified. They are auditing the church servers right now." Chloe finally snapped out of her shocked stupor. She lunged forward, pointing an accusing finger at her mother, her face twisted in absolute disgust. "You stole from a church to pay for my cruise," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You made me an accomplice to federal fraud. How could you be so stupid?" Valerie looked up at her golden child, her tear-streaked face crumpling even further. "I did it for you, Chloe," she wailed desperately, reaching out for her daughter's hand. "I did it so you wouldn't be embarrassed. So your friends wouldn't know Chad was broke. Chloe snatched her hand away as if Valerie's touch would physically burn her. She backed away, shaking her head violently. "Do not blame me for your criminal behavior," she snapped completely, throwing her mother under the bus to save her own skin. "I had no idea Chad was a failure, and I had no idea you were a thief. You are both pathetic." Marcus let out a dark, humorless laugh that echoed strangely in the tense room. He looked at his favorite daughter, watching her instantly turn on the mother who had just risked federal prison to protect her illusion of wealth. He looked at Chad, the brilliant son-in-law, who had secretly driven him into bankruptcy. Then he looked at Valerie, kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the very church officials she had spent years trying to impress. His entire legacy, his entire carefully constructed world of superiority, was a rotting corpse. I remained perfectly still, watching the implosion from the head of the table. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or offer any sarcastic commentary. The absolute destruction of their false reality required no further assistance from me. They had built the gallows, tied the noose, and eagerly placed their own heads inside. I was simply the one who finally kicked away the chair. Pastor Thomas turned his sad, heavy gaze toward me. "Maya," he said quietly, "I am so deeply sorry that your family celebration had to end this way. The board will be pursuing full legal action against your mother and your brother-in-law to recover the stolen funds." I picked up the $3 lottery ticket that was still resting next to Chad's declined credit cards and slipped it back into my suit pocket. "You do not need to worry about recovering the stolen funds, Pastor," I said, my voice calm and completely steady. "As I mentioned, I invited you here tonight to discuss a charitable donation. I will personally replenish the $45,000 stolen from the Youth Center Building Fund by tomorrow morning." Valerie gasped, looking up at me with sudden frantic hope. She thought my financial intervention meant I was going to save her, that I was going to use my wealth to buy her way out of criminal charges. She started thanking me profusely, praising my generous heart. I cut her off immediately. "I am replacing the money for the community, Mother," I stated, looking down at her kneeling figure. "I am not replacing it for you. The police investigation will continue. The federal fraud charges against Chad will proceed. You will both face the absolute legal consequences of your actions. I am simply ensuring that the children of this city do not suffer because of your blinding, toxic greed." I picked up my leather briefcase and stepped away from the table. I walked past Marcus, who was staring blankly at the wall, past Chloe, who was furiously texting on her phone, past Chad, who was still shivering in his chair, and past Valerie, who was weeping on the floor. I did not look back as I walked out the heavy glass doors, leaving the Golden family to finally burn in the fire they had started. Camera tracking shot backing away from the family, leaving them isolated in the frame as the board of directors confronts Valerie. Pastor Thomas stepped forward into the center of the room, his face a rigid mask of profound disappointment and quiet fury. He looked down at Valerie, who remained crumpled on the floor of the VIP suite, her expensive designer evening gown pooling around her knees like a deflated parachute. He did not offer a hand to help her up. Instead, he simply pointed to the thick stack of financial documents and bank ledgers resting on the dining table. $45,000, Valerie Pastor. Thomas stated, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls with heavy absolute authority. "Money donated by hard-working families and elderly parishioners to build a sanctuary for our youth program. You used your executive security clearance to bypass the dual signature requirement. You siphoned those sacred funds directly into a private offshore account to pay for a luxury vacation." Valerie choked on a violent sob, crawling forward to clutch desperately at the hem of the pastor's trousers. She weaponized her tears, launching into a frantic theatrical plea for forgiveness. She babbled incoherently, claiming she intended to put every single penny back before the annual audit. She cried out that the devil had tempted her in a moment of temporary financial panic, and that she was a devout woman who simply made a misguided mistake to protect her daughter. The head of the finance committee, a stern, retired judge, stepped in and cut through her hysterics with surgical precision. He informed her coldly that the local authorities had already seized her church computer hard drives. The frozen accounts confirmed multiple unauthorized wire transfers executed over the past 6 months to cover Chad's margin calls and Chloe's country club dues. He explicitly stated that the board was pressing full felony charges. There would be no quiet sweeping under the rug and no secret restitution. There was going to be a highly public, devastating criminal trial. Marcus watched this scene unfold with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. For 30 years, his entire identity had been wrapped in the illusion of superiority and untouchable social status. The Grace Fellowship Board consisted of his golfing partners, his top-tier business associates, and the most elite members of his country club. In less than 10 minutes, his carefully constructed empire had been entirely vaporized. His son-in-law was a federal criminal facing prison. His daughter was an entitled accomplice stripped of her stolen wealth. And his wife was a confessed embezzler sobbing pathetically at the feet of the very men Marcus had spent decades trying to impress. Marcus's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He turned his back on Valerie, visibly disgusted by the pathetic spectacle she was making on the floor. The terrifying realization of his absolute ruin washed over him like ice water. The bank was foreclosing on his sprawling estate. His immaculate credit was entirely destroyed by Chad's forged high-interest loans. He was completely, hopelessly destitute. Then his desperate, frantic eyes locked onto me. I was standing near the heavy glass doors, silently observing the ashes of their dynasty. Marcus looked at my tailored suit and the calm, confident posture I maintained. He remembered the undeniable proof of my blind trust and the millions of dollars I had just casually deployed to buy up Chad's toxic debt. In his panicked mind, I was no longer the scapegoat daughter to be mocked and discarded. I was a walking, breathing, limitless ATM. Marcus aggressively straightened his ruined posture, attempting to summon the patriarchal authority he had permanently lost the moment his golden family was exposed. He marched toward me, bypassing his weeping wife and his hyperventilating daughter. "Maya," Marcus said, forcing his voice into a tone of desperate manufactured warmth. "Maya, you have to stop this right now. You have to fix this disaster." I did not move a single inch. I simply raised a single eyebrow, inviting him to continue digging his own grave in front of the entire room. He gestured wildly toward Pastor Thomas and the silent board members. "Write the church a check," he demanded, his voice trembling with a frantic, greedy urgency. "Write them a check for double what Valerie took. Pay them off today so they drop the criminal charges. You have the money, Maya. You just proved to us that you have millions in liquid capital." I stared at him, my expression carved from solid ice. I reminded him calmly that I had already offered to replenish the youth fund, but that I would absolutely not bribe a church board to save a thief from a federal prison sentence. Marcus grabbed my arm, his fingers digging sharply into the fabric of my jacket. "You cannot let your mother go to jail," he hissed, the authoritative mask fully cracking to reveal his pure, selfish panic. "You cannot let the bank take our home. If the estate goes into foreclosure, we will have absolutely nothing. We will be out on the street by Monday morning." He leaned in closer, playing the ultimate toxic trump card they had weaponized my entire life. "We are your parents, Maya. We gave you life. We put a roof over your head. You owe us. You are going to call your wealth manager, wire the funds to the bank, and save our house. It is your fundamental duty to this family." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at his fingers until he felt the intense, freezing, completely uncomfortable silence. He slowly released his grip, stepping backward as if he had been physically burned. "Duty to this family," I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue with absolute, unvarnished disgust. "You mean the family that just spent a $2,000 dinner mocking my clothes, my career, and my supposed poverty? The family that handed me a $12,000 bill as a joke? The family that routinely treated me like a pathetic disease while blindly worshiping a con artist?" I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, backing him into the heavy oak table. "You did not put a roof over my head, Marcus. You locked me in the basement of your lives while you paraded Chloe around the penthouse. You watched Chad insult me, and you laughed. You watched Valerie belittle me, and you nodded in agreement. You never protected me. You only ever protected your precious, fragile image." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, to deploy another pathetic layer of parental guilt, but the absolute finality in my eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. "As for your impending homelessness, I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm and quiet register. You are completely correct. The bank issued the final default notice this morning. The foreclosure was absolute and unavoidable. Marcus paled, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He begged me one last time, his voice a pathetic broken whimper, pleading with me to use my millions to pay off the bank before the final paperwork cleared the system. I looked him dead in the eye, savoring the absolute destruction of his arrogant reality. I did pay off the foreclosure, Marcus. I bought the house from the bank yesterday. Camera extreme close-up on the eviction notice sliding across the white tablecloth. I placed my hand on the crisp, heavily watermarked document and slid it directly across the smooth oak surface. It glided over the spilled Bordeaux wine and came to a halt precisely in front of my father. I kept my posture relaxed and my voice completely void of sympathy. Since I am now the sole owner of the property, I am giving you 72 hours to vacate. You told me on Thanksgiving that losers have to rely on luck. Well, your luck just ran out. Marcus stared down at the official bank seal as if the paper were entirely coated in poison. His jaw trembled. The man who had spent his entire life dictating orders and commanding rooms was suddenly reduced to a stammering shell. He reached out with shaking fingers and pulled the document closer. His eyes darted across the legal jargon, the foreclosure confirmation, and the undeniable transfer of deed. He read his own name listed as the defaulted party, and my name listed as the sole unencumbered proprietor. "You cannot do this," he gasped, his voice barely a hollow croak. "This is my house. I built this family. I built that estate. You cannot just buy it out from under me and throw me into the street. I will call my lawyers. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 10 years. I have tenant rights. I have equity. You have absolutely nothing." I corrected him sharply, shutting down his pathetic bluff before it could even begin. "You signed away your equity the moment you allowed Chad to use the estate as collateral for his fraudulent business loans. The bank was preparing to auction the property by Monday morning. I simply bypassed the public spectacle and paid the outstanding balance in cold, hard cash. There are no legal loopholes left for you to exploit, Marcus. You are a trespasser in my home." Chloe suddenly shrieked, breaking the tense silence. Her hands tore at her perfectly styled hair, ruining her expensive blowout. She turned her vicious panic toward her father, aggressively hitting his shoulder. "How could you let this happen?" she screamed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure entitlement. "Where am I supposed to go tonight? Chad is broke. My cars are gone. My credit cards are frozen. I was supposed to move back into the east wing of the estate while the lawyers sorted this out. You promised me I would always have my suite." Marcus did not even look at his golden child. He kept staring at the eviction notice, completely paralyzed by the absolute destruction of his legacy. "You do not have a suite, Chloe," I said, drawing her furious gaze back to me. "The east wing belongs to me. The west wing belongs to me. The imported Italian marble kitchen where you used to sit and mock my career choices belongs to me. You are officially homeless. I suggest you start looking into budget motels before all your secondary credit cards are flagged for fraud." Chloe let out a breathless wail and sank to the floor next to her catatonic husband. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly about her ruined reputation and her lost luxury cruise. For the first time in her pampered, sheltered life, she was facing actual, unavoidable consequences, and the reality was absolutely crushing her. Pastor Thomas stepped forward, the heavy leather portfolio tucked securely under his arm. He looked at Marcus with an expression of profound finality. "Marcus," he said, his voice echoing with deep, unwavering disappointment, "the church board will be holding an emergency session tomorrow morning to officially sever all ties with your family. Your position on the Community Outreach Committee is terminated effectively immediately. We will also be contacting the Country Club Board to inform them of the ongoing federal investigation into your son-in-law and the embezzlement charges against your wife." Marcus flinched as if he had been physically struck. His country club status was his most prized possession, the ultimate symbol of his perceived superiority. "Please, Thomas," he begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "You cannot do this. We have been members of your congregation for 20 years. We are pillars of this community. You know me. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding, Marcus. The head of the financial committee interjected, his tone laced with absolute disgust. Your wife stole from children to fund a luxury vacation. Your son-in-law is a criminal. And you have enabled this toxic culture of greed and deception for decades. May God have mercy on your souls, because this community will not. The board members turned in unison, their footsteps heavy and deliberate as they marched toward the exit. They did not look back. The heavy frosted glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing my family inside the wreckage of their own making. Valerie watched her entire social empire vanish through those doors. The affluent friends she had spent years manipulating, the charity boards she controlled, the elite status she wore like a crown. All of it was permanently gone. She was no longer the respected, wealthy matriarch of Beacon Hill. She was a confessed thief facing federal prison. She turned her frantic, tear-streaked face toward me. Maya, she whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Maya, please. You have made your point. You have proven how smart and successful you are. You won. Now please, sweetheart, call the bank. Tell the pastor you were just upset. We can fix this as a family. You cannot put your own mother in jail and throw your father onto the street. I looked at her with a completely blank expression. I am not doing anything to you, Valerie. I am simply letting you experience the life you actually earned. You have 72 hours to pack your clothes. Do not try to take the antique silver or the artwork. I already had my legal team inventory the entire house. Valerie stared at me, her eyes wide with desperate panic. She realized that her usual weapons, guilt manipulation and aggressive condescension, were completely useless against my absolute financial dominance. I owned her home. I held the evidence of her crimes. I was entirely untouchable. Her breathing suddenly became shallow and erratic. She raised her hand to her throat, clutching her pearl necklace as her eyes fluttered wildly. She let out a loud, dramatic gasp that echoed perfectly in the quiet room. Valerie's knees buckled. She threw her arms out blindly, knocking a silver serving tray off the table as she went down. She collapsed onto the thick carpet, landing in a heap of designer fabric and sprawling limbs. She lay perfectly still, her eyes closed tight, fully expecting the entire room to drop everything and rush to her aid. Camera high-angle shot looking down at Valerie on the floor, showcasing her pathetic attempt at manipulation. She lay perfectly still on the expensive Persian rug, waiting for the dramatic gasps of horror, the rush of frantic footsteps, and the concerned cries of her husband. She waited for Marcus to drop to his knees and lift her head, for Pastor Thomas to offer a frantic prayer of healing, for the entire room to halt their accusations and prioritize her fragile well-being. She had used this exact theatrical tactic for decades to escape any conversation that did not serve her narrative. Instead, the room responded with absolute chilling silence. No one moved a single muscle. Marcus remained frozen, staring blankly at his eviction notice. The church board members simply looked down at her with expressions of cold, clinical disgust. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire childhood making me feel entirely invisible, and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I dialed the emergency line, putting the phone to my ear as my voice cut clearly through the quiet room. Yes, I need paramedics at the Belmont Restaurant via IP Suite 3, I said, maintaining a completely flat, businesslike tone. We have a 60-year-old woman experiencing a severe panic attack. She just confessed to federal embezzlement in front of her church board, and her body has gone into shock. No, she is conscious and breathing. She is just highly dramatic. I suggest bringing a psychiatric evaluation team. Valerie's eyelids fluttered violently. She instantly realized she was not getting a wave of sympathetic coddling, she was getting a forced medical hold. She scrambled to sit up, her pristine hair now tangled, and her dignity completely vaporized. I am fine, she hissed, wiping away her fake tears and glaring at me with pure venom. Hang up the phone. While all eyes were momentarily fixed on Valerie's pathetic resurrection, a chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor. Chad had watched the church board effectively excommunicate his mother-in-law. He had watched me buy the very ground out from under his in-laws. He knew the church's financial audit meant his predatory loan trail was now fully exposed to the authorities. His survival instinct finally overrode his stunned paralysis. He slowly backed away from the dining table, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy brass handles of the kitchen service exit. He took one quiet step toward the back of the room, then another. Marcus did not try to stop him. Chloe was too busy staring at the eviction notice to even notice her husband abandoning her. Chad reached the heavy mahogany service doors. He pushed them open, desperate to slip into the dark alleyway and disappear into the city before the church board could fully articulate the extent of his financial crimes to the police. The heavy doors swung outward, but Chad did not step through. He collided violently with a solid wall of dark blue uniforms. Two local police officers stood in the narrow service corridor, flanking a sharp-eyed federal agent holding a thick manila folder. The flashing red and blue lights from the alleyway illuminated the pure terror washing over Chad's face. Chadwick Montgomery. The federal agent stated, his voice easily cutting through the tension of the VIP room. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and bank fraud. Chad stumbled backward, raising his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. The officers moved with absolute clinical efficiency, grabbing his wrists and spinning him around against the wall. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the dining room was the loudest sound of the entire night. Chad looked over his shoulder, his eyes wide and panicked, searching the room for someone to save him. He looked at Marcus, who simply turned his head away in disgust. He looked at Chloe, who stared at the handcuffs as if they were alien artifacts. Valerie let out a genuine horrifying shriek as they hauled her golden son-in-law out the door. The church board members gathered their stolen ledgers and followed the officers out, casting one final look of utter contempt at my parents before the heavy doors swung shut, sealing their absolute doom. The VIP room was practically empty now, just the four of us standing in the wreckage of a 30-year lie. Chloe slowly lifted her head. The arrogant, untouchable golden child who had spent her entire life treating me like a disposable stepping stone was entirely broken. The realization of her new reality was hitting her in real time. Her husband was on his way to a federal holding cell. Her parents were officially evicted and facing bankruptcy. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her designer wardrobe, her country club tabs, and her Mediterranean cruises were gone forever. She was completely, utterly destitute. She looked at me, the sister she had mocked just an hour ago for wearing an off-the-rack suit. She looked at the woman who had quietly built a massive technology empire while she was busy bragging about stolen crypto profits. Chloe's knees buckled. It was not a fake faint like her mother's performance. It was the physical collapse of a woman who suddenly realized she had zero survival skills in the real world. She hit the hardwood floor hard, crawling desperately across the spilled red wine and shattered glass. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my designer skirt, her knuckles white with absolute desperation. "Maya, please," Chloe sobbed, her voice a pathetic, jagged wheeze. "You have your own tech company. You have millions. I can work. I will do anything. I can be your assistant. I can fetch your coffee. Please, Maya, give me a job." Camera low angle, looking up at Maya. The lighting catches the sharp lines of her face, casting her in a powerful, almost statuesque glow. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman clutching the hem of my skirt. Chloe's perfectly manicured nails were stained with spilled wine, and her mascara ran in dark, jagged streaks down her pale cheeks. For 31 years, this was the sister who had delighted in my misery. This was the golden child who had relentlessly mocked my clothes, my ambitions, and my mere existence. Now she was groveling on a sticky restaurant floor, offering to fetch my coffee just to survive the winter. I reached down and grasped her wrists. I did not yank or shove. I simply applied a firm, steady pressure, peeling her trembling fingers off my tailored fabric one by one. I stepped back, smoothing the non-existent wrinkles from my skirt, and let her hands drop uselessly back into the puddle of shattered glass and ruined wine. "Chloe," I said, my voice dropping into a register of quiet, lethal calm that instantly silenced her sobbing. "I do not want you fetching my coffee. I do not want you answering my phones. I do not want you anywhere near my company or my life." She looked up at me, her chest heaving, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. But why, she choked out. We are blood, Maya. We are sisters. You have enough money to save all of us. You could fix this entire nightmare with a single phone call. Why are you doing this? I am doing this because for 31 years I was the designated scapegoat of this family. I explained, staring directly into her tear-filled eyes. For 3 decades I was explicitly ordered to shrink myself so you could shine. I was told my dreams were foolish, so your delusions of grandeur could be celebrated. I was treated like a genetic disappointment while you and Chad paraded around spending stolen money and demanding our parents worship you. You never once acted like a sister Chloe. You acted like a warden, and I was your favorite prisoner. Marcus finally found his voice, taking a weak, staggering step forward. Maya, please, he rasped, his entire posture broken. We made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But if you walk away now, we will lose everything. You cannot just abandon us to the streets. You are our daughter. I turned my cold gaze to the man who had just spent the entire evening treating me like a pathetic beggar. I am abandoning you, Marcus, because saving you means allowing the disease to continue, I stated cleanly, without a single ounce of hesitation. If I pay off the bank, if I clear Valerie's embezzlement charges, if I hire Chloe, I am simply funding the exact same toxic generational curse that kept me miserable for 30 years. You demanded absolute perfection while harboring absolute corruption. I refuse to be the financial life support system for a family that actively hates me. You built this beautiful rotting house of cards entirely on your own. Now you get to live in the wreckage. I turned away from their horrified faces and walked purposefully toward the large mahogany service station where the restaurant manager was standing. He had been silently observing the entire catastrophic implosion, his eyes wide and his posture stiff with absolute shock. The waitstaff had gathered nervously near the kitchen doors, watching the wealthy elite completely unravel. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out 3 crisp $1 bills. I placed them gently on the polished wooden counter, smoothing them flat. I believe I had 1 glass of sparkling water when I first arrived, I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite and conversational. This should cover my portion of the evening. The manager blinked, looking from the $3 to the spectacular disaster unfolding in the center of the VIP suite. He cleared his throat nervously, his hands visibly shaking as he held the leather-bound checkbook. Miss, what about the rest of the check? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. The vintage Bordeaux, the caviar service, the tomahawk steaks. The total balance is exactly $12,340. I offered him a brief, razor-sharp smile. That sounds like a significant problem for the people who actually ordered and consumed those items, I replied, gesturing casually over my shoulder toward Marcus and Chloe. I highly recommend securing a valid credit card from them before they attempt to leave. Though given their current legal and financial situation, you might want to call the local authorities to report a theft of services right now. Chad's credit cards are officially frozen, and Marcus has 0 equity to his name. Marcus let out a strangled gasp of pure terror, realizing he was about to be arrested for dining and dashing at the most exclusive restaurant in the city. He patted his empty pockets, a fresh wave of panic washing over his face, as he realized he possessed absolutely no means to pay the massive bill. Chloe resumed her hysterical sobbing, burying her face in the expensive carpet, unable to cope with the sheer embarrassment of becoming a destitute criminal in public. I did not wait to watch the manager dial the police. I simply turned and walked out the heavy frosted glass doors. Camera slow-motion tracking shot following Maya from behind as she strides down the lavishly carpeted hallway of the restaurant. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of the VIP room vanished the moment the doors swung shut behind me. The heavy silence of the corridor felt like a cleansing wave. The crisp, cool night air hit my face as I stepped out the main entrance of the restaurant, and the deep inhalation filled my lungs with absolute, intoxicating freedom. I had finally severed the toxic, rotting umbilical cord that had anchored me to their misery. The weight of their expectations, their judgments, and their relentless cruelty dissolved into the freezing winter wind. A sleek, pristine black Maybach glided smoothly up to the curb, the tires whispering against the damp pavement. My driver stepped out immediately, opening the heavy rear door with a respectful nod. "Good evening, Miss Williams," he said, his tone entirely professional, holding his arm out to shield me from the cold. Was the family dinner a success? I paused for a fraction of a second, looking back at the glowing windows of the restaurant. I could faintly hear the approaching sirens of the local police cruisers echoing through the downtown streets, coming to collect the shattered remains of the Golden family. Coming to arrest the thieves, the frauds, and the failures who had once believed they owned the world. I turned back to the driver, slipping gracefully into the luxurious leather interior of the Maybach. "It was exactly what it needed to be," I replied, leaning into the comfort of the seats. "Take me home." The door closed with a solid, heavy thud, shutting out the noise of the sirens, the city, and the past. As the car pulled seamlessly away from the curb, merging into the steady stream of nighttime traffic, I closed my eyes. The generational curse was broken. The scapegoat was dead. I was finally, truly untouchable. Camera. A montage of moving shots, panning over news articles, legal documents, and the physical consequences of the family's actions. The next 6 months played out like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of consequences. The dominoes I had carefully lined up finally toppled, each one striking the next with devastating precision. The local newspapers and business journals had an absolute field day. The headlines were relentless and unforgiving. Beacon Hill philanthropist embezzles millions from children's charity. Golden Boy tech investor indicted in massive federal wire fraud. Prominent socialite family faces absolute bankruptcy. I watched it all unfold from the quiet, secure sanctuary of my penthouse office, sipping my morning coffee, while the world devoured the scandalous truth about my family. The federal prosecutors dismantled Chad's fraudulent empire brick by stolen brick. His trial was remarkably short and entirely devoid of the charm he usually used to slither out of consequences. The paper trail, the ledgers, the offshore accounts. It was all too comprehensive and far too damning for any high-priced defense attorney to dispute. Chad was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. The smug, arrogant man who had constantly belittled my career choices and laughed at my modest lifestyle was now wearing a state-issued jumpsuit. All of his assets, his luxury vehicles, his imported watches, his offshore accounts were entirely seized by the government to pay back the investors he had scammed. His spectacular downfall was broadcast on every local news station, a permanent digital stain on his supposed legacy. Without Chad's stolen income and without our parents' bottomless bank accounts to bail her out, Chloe experienced a brutal crash, landing into reality. The massive estate she was supposed to inherit was auctioned off by the bank to cover outstanding debts. Her designer handbags, her imported shoes, her custom jewelry. Everything she had ever valued was repossessed or sold at auction to cover her mounting legal fees. The sister who had once shrieked in horror at the mere idea of staying in a 4-star hotel was forced to rent a cramped, moldy studio apartment on the far industrial side of the city. I occasionally received updates from old acquaintances who took deep, vicious pleasure in spotting her. Chloe, the former queen of the country club, was now working double shifts at a budget retail store just to keep her electricity turned on. Her hands, once perfectly manicured and soft, were now dry and blistered from unboxing heavy inventory and operating cash registers for minimum wage. She was forced to serve the exact same demographic of working-class people. She had weaponized her arrogance against her entire life. She rode the public transit shivering in the freezing rain while waiting at unsheltered bus stops. She clipped grocery coupons, carefully calculating the cost of generic brand pasta and canned soup. The golden child was entirely stripped of her gold, reduced to a life of sheer, exhausting survival, where every single dollar was a desperate battle. I knew she must cry herself to sleep every night, mourning the absolute privilege she had so carelessly squandered. Marcus and Valerie faced an even steeper and more humiliating descent. The church board did exactly what Pastor Thomas had promised. They permanently excommunicated my parents, wiping their names from every brass plaque, every outreach committee, and every social registry in the county. The country club swiftly revoked their lifetime membership, citing the strict moral turpitude clause in their bylaws. The wealthy elite society, friends my mother had spent decades meticulously cultivating, abandoned her instantly terrified that her highly toxic public reputation would taint their own delicate social standing. Nobody returned her calls, nobody invited them to dinner. They became complete social pariahs overnight. Facing absolute bankruptcy, federal fines, and the crushing weight of public disgrace, my parents were swiftly evicted from their temporary housing. With no friends to lean on and zero credit to secure a lease, they eventually relocated to a dilapidated trailer park 40 miles outside the city limits. The grand matriarch and patriarch of Beacon Hill were reduced to living in a fading aluminum box, counting pennies to afford basic necessities. I heard Marcus spent his days sitting in a cheap plastic lawn chair, staring blankly at the gravel driveway, paralyzed by the overwhelming shame of his exposed corruption. Valerie refused to even show her face at the local discount grocery store, terrified someone might recognize the disgraced socialite who had stolen from sick children. The illusion of the perfect parents was completely annihilated by the very system of wealth and status they had worshipped above their own daughter. They had spent my entire childhood demanding absolute perfection while harboring absolute corruption in their own hearts. They had taught me that love was transactional, and now their accounts were entirely overdrawn. They had built a beautiful rotting house of cards, and now they were buried under it, permanently exiled from the only world they ever cared about. I did not feel pity. I did not feel guilt. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I had not destroyed them. I had simply stepped out of the way and let gravity take its natural course. I refused to be their financial life support, and the moment I removed myself, their entire toxic ecosystem collapsed inward. While they suffocated in the wreckage of their own making, my life accelerated into an entirely new stratosphere. The acquisition of my software company by a major global tech conglomerate finalized just weeks after that fateful dinner at the restaurant. I did not just walk away with a massive 9-figure payout, I walked away with complete creative control and a permanent seat at the billionaire table. I was no longer the invisible scapegoat. I was a recognized industry titan. But I had no interest in hoarding wealth just for the sake of status. I had learned firsthand how toxic that pursuit could be. Instead, I funneled a significant portion of that capital into a brand new venture. I wanted to build an ecosystem that actually supported brilliant, overlooked minds. Women who had been told they were not good enough. Innovators who had the raw talent but lacked the arrogant entitlement required to secure traditional venture capital. I was creating a space where ambition was nurtured, not crushed, and where success was earned through actual hard work rather than manipulation and theft. I poured my heart, my resources, and my undisputed power into making it a reality. Camera. The view transitions back to the present day, pushing through the heavy glass doors of a massive state-of-the-art tech incubator. Camera dynamic Steadicam shot matching the opening. Maya is walking through her tech incubator, smiling warmly at a group of young black female developers. She returns to her office and looks directly into the lens. The air inside the incubator hummed with a specific kind of electricity. It was the sound of raw, unbridled potential. I walked past glass-walled conference rooms where brilliant minds were actively rewriting the future. There were no country club dress codes here. There were no hushed, judgmental whispers about pedigree or designer labels. There was only pure, unapologetic innovation. I stopped by a cluster of standing desks where 3 young African-American high school students were intensely focused on a complex string of code. They were part of our inaugural fellowship cohort building an artificial intelligence application designed to optimize renewable energy grids in underserved urban communities. One of the girls, a brilliant 16-year-old named Keisha, looked up and caught my eye. She pointed to her monitor, her face completely illuminated by the glow of the screen and the sheer pride of a major breakthrough. I smiled warmly, giving her a firm nod of absolute approval. I did not offer her empty flattery or condescending praise. I treated her like the exceptional engineer she was already becoming. That was the exact culture I demanded in this building. Excellence without ego, support without suffocation. The incubator itself is a testament to everything my parents despised. It is loud, it is diverse, it is wonderfully unpredictable. Every corner of this facility is designed to foster collaboration and disrupt the status quo. We do not just teach these young women how to write code or pitch investors. We teach them how to fiercely advocate for their own worth. We teach them how to identify their value and demand the compensation they deserve without a single drop of hesitation. I continued down the bright sunlit corridor and stepped into my private office. Unlike the dark, oppressive mahogany studies my father used to favor, my space was entirely encased in floor-to-ceiling glass. It was open, transparent, and flooded with natural light. I walked around my streamlined desk, leaned back against the edge of the smooth white surface, and looked directly into the camera. When the acquisition of my company was finalized, the financial press became utterly obsessed with my net worth. They wanted to know how I was going to spend the massive influx of capital. They expected the stereotypical displays of sudden wealth. They watched for the acquisition of super yachts, the purchase of sprawling private islands, the ostentatious fleet of imported luxury sports cars. They expected me to fall into the exact same trap of mindless toxic consumption that had utterly destroyed Chad and Chloe. But they fundamentally misunderstood what money actually represents. Wealth is not a personality trait. It is a magnifier. It takes whatever is already inside of you and amplifies it to an exponential degree. It amplified Chad's bottomless greed. It amplified Valerie's shallow vanity. It amplified Chloe's aggressive entitlement. And for me, it amplified my profound desire to build something that actually mattered. I did not buy a yacht. I bought entire city blocks in historically redlined districts and transformed them into state-of-the-art technology campuses. I took the millions of dollars that my family would have easily squandered on seasonal wardrobes and Mediterranean cruises, and I redirected every single cent into a massive foundation. We fund comprehensive STEM programs strictly for young African American girls. We provide full-ride university scholarships, coding boot camps, and early-stage venture capital for female founders who are repeatedly ignored by traditional banking institutions. I look at girls like Keisha and I see the exact same spark I had at her age. But unlike me, she will never be told that her dreams are too big or her presence is an inconvenience. She will never be forced to shrink herself to make someone else feel comfortable. I am building the exact tables I was once barred from sitting at, and I am making sure these girls always have a seat of honor. The concept of family has also entirely shifted for me over the past 6 months. For 3 decades, I exhausted myself trying to earn a single scrap of genuine affection from people who viewed my independence as a threat. I bled myself dry trying to fix a foundation that was completely rotten to the core. Now I am surrounded by a chosen family. I have a board of directors who challenge my intellect and respect my vision. I have brilliant colleagues who value authenticity over appearances. I have a circle of fiercely loyal friends who celebrate my victories without a single ounce of hidden jealousy. We share meals together that are filled with loud, joyous laughter instead of tense, passive-aggressive interrogations. We support each other through failures without weaponizing those vulnerabilities later. I finally understand what a healthy ecosystem looks and feels like, and it has absolutely nothing to do with shared DNA. Blood is merely a biological accident. Loyalty is an active daily choice. I spent my entire childhood believing that I was fundamentally flawed because the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally treated me like a ghost. I internalized their neglect and wore it like a heavy, suffocating cloak. Walking away from them was the most terrifying decision of my life, because society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, regardless of the abuse inflicted. But breaking that generational curse was the only way to save my own life. The trauma bond is officially shattered. I rarely think about the trailer park outside the city limits or the federal penitentiary where Chad is currently serving his sentence. The burning anger that once fueled my long nights of coding has entirely evaporated. It has been replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. They thought money would make me their savior. But money just amplified the truth. It gave me the power to walk away from a table that never had a seat for me in the first place. Camera slow pull out as Maya smiles a genuine peaceful smile. Blood doesn't make a family. Respect does. If you're sitting at a table where they hand you scraps and expect gratitude, maybe it's time you flip the table. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments below. Stay strong and never apologize for your success. Camera fade to black.